This is a story about Montgomery, Alabama, a railroad story. Walking through downtown Montgomery, the influence of railroads is immediately visible. From Union Station on the riverfront, through which millions of travelers passed on countless journeys for more than a century, to the only remaining freight station out of 7 originally here. Railroads made livelihoods, hopes, and dreams possible. At its peak, Montgomery hosted 6 railroads: the Atlantic Coastline, the Central of Georgia, the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio, the Louisville and Nashville, the Seaboard Airline, and the West Point route, with its partner railroads, the Western Railway of Alabama and the Atlanta and West Point Railroad. Downtown, freight moved between shippers and receivers. People arrived and departed on journeys of possibility and pleasure throughout the Southeast and to every corner of the nation. All of this was made possible by the men and women who took care of the trains, the locomotives, the coaches, sleepers and lounges, the freight cars, and the tracks themselves. At the peak of railroad passenger travel in the 1920s, large workforces staffed roundhouses and repair shops to keep the steam locomotives maintained and ready to run. They repaired, cleaned, and stocked passenger cars. They assembled freight trains for efficient delivery of important goods. This all happened on the edges of downtown Montgomery. The largest of these shops complexes was the Western Railway of Alabama car and engine shops, employing as many as 700 workers during its heyday from the 1910s to the mid-1950s. First appearing on the west side of North Court Street in the 1850s, this maintenance facility began its life serving the Western Railway of Alabama's predecessor railroads, the Montgomery Railroad, the Montgomery and West Point Railroad, and the Western Railroad of Alabama, moving to the east side of North Court after the Civil War. Skilled tradesmen worked in the various shops, including the carpenter shop, machine shop, air and brake shop, wheel and axle shop, planing and pattern shop, upholstery shop, car repair shop, blacksmith shop, paint shop, laboratory, roundhouse, and boiler shop, among other roles. However, throughout the Western Railway of Alabama and its predecessor's history, all of this work was undertaken under the strict rules of slavery prior to the Civil War and Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction. Only in the very last few years of its history, from 1965 to 1971, were these rules eliminated. This meant that workers termed skilled could only be white, and that African American employees were helpers or laborers. The shop's roundhouse records from the 1890s bear witness to the substantial differences in pay based on this caste system. A former carman, that is an employee trained to repair passenger and freight cars, reported that at the height of Jim Crow, who could do what was strictly regulated. For example, helpers in the car shops, even one with 30 years' experience in car repair, were not allowed to make the final tightening of a bolt or driving of a rivet in a repair, but a white apprentice with only months of experience was allowed to accomplish this task. Section gangs were teams of workers who maintained track at the shops and up and down the main line. They consisted of a white foreman and a team of African American track laborers who did the heavy work of replacing ties and rails and maintaining the roadway ballast. Railroad jobs, including shop jobs, were still some of the best jobs available to African Americans during Jim Crow. Union pay scales and pension plans made these coveted positions. With the Civil Rights Act of 1965, however, all positions could be held. An African American section gang laborer with many years' experience, named Henry Caffey, would, for example, become roadmaster in the late 1960s. He was in charge of all the West Point route track from Selma to Atlanta. This story is about the men and women who worked in the shops themselves, about the work they did, the service they rendered, and kinds of facilities they needed for this work. It's a story we share now in celebration of the contributions these workers made to Montgomery and the state of Alabama, and of the fragments of the site that remain in existence to this day. The Western Railway of Alabama car and engine shops were the heart and soul of the company. Employees here kept the railroad ready to run. They repaired wrecked and worn-out passenger and freight cars, built and upholstered furniture for the passenger cars, and overhauled locomotives. The Western of Alabama shops not only maintained the company's own locomotives and rolling stock, but also performed these services for other railroads, such as the Birmingham and Southeastern and the Tuskegee Railroads. In 1899, the shops had reached a joint use agreement with the larger Central of Georgia Railroad. These shops were lean and efficient. They were reputed to have the highest, most up-to-date standards in the early 20th century. The Western Railway of Alabama was first chartered as the Montgomery Railroad in 1832, making it among the first in the nation, though by 1841 only 32 miles of tracks had been laid. The initiative to build this railroad was led by Abner McGehee and a group of ambitious investors. This included many of Montgomery's most prominent early citizens. Originating in Montgomery, the railway would run northeast to Atlanta. Enslaved Africans would create the grade and lay the track. Construction of the railroad was completed to West Point, Georgia in the spring of 1851, where it was met by the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad 3 years later. The line only reached Selma during Reconstruction in 1870, operating now as the Western Railroad of Alabama. In 1883, this railroad was given a new name, the Western Railway of Alabama, and it was given a new charter. Now, jointly managed with the Atlanta and West Point and Georgia railroads, the shops became a maintenance and repair hub for what became known as the West Point route. The Civil War had been harsh on the railroad. 1/3 of travel on the railroad was the transportation of troops at half the normal rate. Material shortages made maintenance nearly impossible. The original shops were burned and the surrounding rails destroyed near the close of the war in 1865 by General James H. Wilson and his troops during his famous raid through Alabama. The shops had been a primary target for destruction. The railroad struggled throughout Reconstruction, and the shops had to work with old equipment until 1897. That year, fire had partially destroyed the roundhouse and the machine shops on the west side of North Court, where Sable Steel is today, damaging 10 locomotives. Most of the damage was covered by insurance, and these funds, along with new investment money, spurred on a massive rebuilding effort. Many new buildings were built or repaired and expanded. A great deal of new equipment was purchased. The capability of the shops expanded and increased in quality. Freight cars were built from scratch. Passenger cars were beautifully furnished, and locomotives were maintained. Some rolling stock required only maintenance or small repairs, but locomotives and cars were sometimes disassembled and rebuilt with new parts and new efficiencies. Most of these parts were made here from molten iron and steel in the forges of the blacksmith shop, and fashioned on the heavy equipment in the machine shop and planing mill. These machines were powered by a belt system that can still be seen in the corners of the planing mill ceiling. The new buildings were pivotal in expanding operations. Almost all rolling stock owned by the West Point route was built, rebuilt, or repaired in the Montgomery shops. The steam engine was a marvel of engineering, and maintaining and running them was a dirty business. Countless moving parts required precision work, and each building housed specific operations. Many of the buildings became stained by smoke and coal dust. The smell of hot iron and burned coal pervaded the workplace. However, at certain times of the day, there were the hunger-inducing fragrances of meat-and-three lunches brought from home and reheated on the shop radiators. Under the 400-foot-long steel roof of the car shed, employees finished building or repaired passenger and freight cars. Between 300 and 400 boxcars were built here from the ground up. The wheel trucks and framing would be constructed elsewhere in the shops, and then brought in the shed and attached to the car frame. Carmen riveted the steel plates to the exterior of the cars and installed the internal woodworking. The wheel pit created a space underneath cars for carmen to remove individual wheels or axles or work on the trucks. Railcar wheels, even today, need to be frequently inspected and replaced. For example, when hairline cracks appear or when emergency braking creates flat spots on the wheels. From time to time, passenger cars would need to have a wheel changed with passengers still in it, as this process did not take long. Steel scaffolds lined the outside tracks, while a hanging wooden scaffold lined the inner tracks. Wrecking trains extracted and transported damaged cars to the southwest corner of the shed for repair. On the northwest corner of the shed, a 62-foot brick building housed a battery and car lighting shop. Railcar batteries, especially for passenger cars, were charged here, and job equipment not in use would be stored here. Once the construction was finished, a switcher, or yard mule, moved the car further south into the brick paint shop. One of the first brick buildings completed during the rebuilding of the shops was the paint shop in 1900. In contrast to the neighboring planing mill, this building was framed with wood instead of steel. The floor was concrete with vitrified brick between the tracks. Most industrial architecture was plain and utilitarian, but the Montgomery shops were built with some aesthetic beauty in the brickwork. There is a nearly 8-foot wide circular window near the apex of the southern wall, and the tall windows lining the building's sides were topped with brick arches. This building was where passenger cars, baggage cars, and coaches were painted before being put into operation. This required the shop to be very clean to ensure a quality look to the car after so much work had gone into them by other departments. The main entrance was on the east wall, near the southeast corner, rather than the center of the south wall. This positioned the employee next to the paint mixing room, office, and showers on the southern end of the building. Cut glass was also stored here for replacing windows in the cars. Stencils were handed out of the offices through a service window when they were needed. Prior to painting, the cars were carefully sanded. When painting was taking place, and while it was drying, most of the windows and doors were closed to ensure a consistent surface. While lighting was good in the building, the ventilation was not, and potentially hazardous fumes tended to build up in this building. The painting operations took place on a system of sliding adjustable scaffolds. There were fewer pneumatic power tools here than in some of the other shops, but welding and cutting must have been a frequent operation, as there were 8 oxyacetylene torch stations along the walls. Until the coming of diesel locomotives on the Western Railway of Alabama, a change the West Point route completed across the system by July 1954, the south end of the paint shop also contained a small laboratory for testing scale prevention additives that were added to the water in the steam engines. The planing mill, just east of the paint shop, housed the woodworking operations of the shops. On the first floor, carpenters formed the large wooden structural pieces for the cars, and coach furniture parts were roughed out. This area of the planing mill also produced highly precise wooden forms, or patterns, which the nearby foundry would use to forge locomotive wheels, drawbars, smokestacks, smokebox doors, and so forth. Many large machine tools occupied this space, such as planers, bandsaws, milling machines, and joiners. A large steel lift in the northwest corner of the building lifted furniture parts sent to the second floor for finishing. Next to the lift, space was provided for workers to cut and stitch the large belts required to operate machinery throughout the shops. The operations on the second floor were divided into 3 parts. The upholstery shop fitted furniture with fabric and cushions in an area near the lift itself. Many racks beyond the upholstery shop to the south stored the wooden patterns created in the first floor below. Skilled carpenters built cabinet and interior parts for passenger cars. This was also where finer woods, such as cocobolo and poplar, were stored. There was even a shop in this area that produced beautiful stained glass work for passenger car transoms above the windows and in the car clerestories. Just to the north of the planing mill, and sharing a connecting wall, was the wheel and axle shop. As the name implies, this is where the surface profiles of rolling stock wheels were machined to precise specifications and pressed onto the axles. Wheels needed to be quickly installed into the wheel trucks without having to waste time reshaping or adjusting. During the steam era, locomotive driving wheels had what were known as tires. These tires were steel rings heated to expand the inner diameter and then pressed onto the cast iron wheel. This process enabled crews to change a worn or damaged tire without having to replace the entire wheel. A brass foundry on the eastern wall of the building created brass bushings and other forged brass parts needed throughout the shops. A small metal shed nearby contained the wheel and axle shop's mobile fire extinguisher. This was simply a fire hose rolled up on a two-wheeled spool with a forward-facing push handle for two men to move the hose wherever it was needed. The shop's complex contained several such sheds distributed around the property. The hydrants were fed by water contained in the tall steel standpipe on the eastern edge of the site. Repairs and maintenance to the railroad rolling stock required a wide array of jobs performed at the blacksmith shop. This shop, completed in 1898, was 83 feet long and 38 feet wide, and constructed of brick and clerestory ventilation. This is a natural type of ventilation in hot climates where cooler air comes through windows on the ground floor and hot air rises through vents in the roof. This same system was used on coaches. In the shop, skilled tradesmen forged tools, made roughed-out dies to be completed in the machine shop, and constructed larger parts such as couplers, truck sides, and bolsters. This would have been a blisteringly hot job. The blacksmith shop was the only building with an earthen floor. All others either had brick or concrete flooring. Sometimes, newly forged iron parts were dropped onto the dirt to quickly cool and harden them. The softer earthen floor helped to prevent damage to not yet fully hardened iron. In the mid-1920s, machines were purchased for the shop to help with steel spring production. In the late 1920s, a huge 12-inch piston steam hammer was purchased that was said to have shaken the ground of the entire complex when it was used. Completed in 1902, the Western Railway of Alabama's 20-stall roundhouse was built to replace a smaller 16-stall roundhouse that occupied what is now the Sable Steel scrapyard on North Court Street. It housed steam locomotives while they were inactive, under repair, or receiving regular maintenance prior to a scheduled run. A new 80-foot turntable was installed in 1903 to replace a smaller one that had been plagued by construction flaws. The new turntable was powered by a Weir and Craig pressurized air motor. The floor of the roundhouse was made of vitrified brick, and many of the stalls had drop pits for working under an engine. During the 1920s, as steam locomotives grew in size, the company once again replaced the turntable, installing a 100-foot turntable that lasted some years beyond the end of the steam operations in 1954. Proving its continued usefulness in turning even diesel locomotives around for correct positioning at the front of a train. A tender shop extended about 110 feet from one of the stalls on the north side of the roundhouse. A tender, or coal car, was attached to a steam engine by means of a more permanent drawbar instead of a coupler, and provided both water and fuel to power the locomotive. The tender shop made both heavy and light repairs to these tenders. In 1921, management added a new office and segregated locker and washrooms to the south side of the roundhouse. A short walk to the south was a small brick building that housed the toilets. By 1962, the roundhouse had been dismantled, and all that remained were the brick and concrete foundations. However, the turntable continued to operate. The shops required a substantial water supply for fueling steam trains, which was kept in an underground reservoir and a massive 15-foot wide and 120-foot tall steel standpipe. Water was supplied by a company-owned pump, but could be connected to the city water supply in case of a fire. For an example of how much water was required at the shops, the tender attached to locomotive number 378, a 282 Mikado-type freight locomotive, could hold up to 10,000 gallons of water. At the height of steam operations, the West Point route's fleet included locomotives with tender capacities ranging from 3,000 to 11,000 gallons, depending on the size and purpose of the locomotive. The largest and last two steam locomotives purchased by the West Point route in 1944 had tenders with an 18,000-gallon water capacity. The standpipe's capacity was 158,619 gallons of water, enough to keep these locomotives well supplied. The roundhouse was built to house up to 20 locomotives and their tenders, so the need for water was high. Built in 1913 by the Roberts and Schaefer Company of Chicago, the 600-ton capacity coaling tower, or coal chute, was newer than most of the complex's brick buildings and is one of the few surviving structures. The 39-foot by 34-foot structural concrete frame of the tower rises 60 feet above the surrounding ground. It replaced a smaller wooden chute built in 1902. This was dirty work. Operators filled measured hoppers for loading correct amounts of fresh coal into locomotive tenders. The men who worked in this area of the shops also operated the shop mule. This was a small steam crane on rail trucks used to remove coal cinders from the nearby cinder pit by loading them into an open hopper car for disposal elsewhere. Water columns, used for filling the water tanks of locomotive tenders, were placed on the southeast and northwest corners of the coaling tower. Maintenance of way tracks were just west of the coaling tower. Tracks just to the east provided a location where older wooden boxcars were partially torn down in preparation for rebuilding with steel plate siding. This was a strenuous job that would be, at times, used to discipline young workers and apprentices. Between the roundhouse and the freight car repair shed was a two-story concrete storage and locker room that remains on the site today. The first floor was filled with small parts bins. On the upper floor were lockers, showers, and large, round hand-washing fountains. To the south of the building was an expansive concrete platform covered with a gable-type roof extending from the storeroom to the acetylene house. A wrought iron fence 6 feet high enclosed the entire platform on both sides. The platform provided storage for both freight and passenger car parts, such as metal pilots and footboards, and for steam locomotives there were couplers, draft gears, yokes, springs, brake cylinders, reservoirs, valves, etc. There was also a rack for storing 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of metal used to repair the cars. The Western Railway of Alabama had a close partnership with the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and the Georgia Railroad. These three were considered short-line railroads, but which also carried important mainline trains, such as the New York to New Orleans Crescent and Piedmont Limited. Being a small railroad, everyone who worked for the West Point route knew each other, and the associated companies created social activities, competitive sports, and even marching bands at the Montgomery, Atlanta, and Augusta shops. The shops employed hundreds of workers, whose spouses and children participated in the company's social activities. The company magazine, The Courier, reported on new buildings, steam engine, and passenger rebuilds. At times it also reported on the quality work of various employees from all three railroads. It even extended into the social and civic lives of the employees. For example, it described the shop's baseball team games play-by-play. It discussed competitions in which the shop's marching band participated and often won. It reported on new fashions for women, precocious children of employees, and even showcased homes of various workers. It also notified employees when a coworker died and when a new child arrived in a family. Many companies during the 1920s developed similar company magazines to encourage a sense of community and increase loyalty and productivity. They also served as a response to increasing labor activism. Prior to the renaissance of the shops, a series of strikes in 1894 had crippled railroads throughout the country. Labor disputes had brought both conflict within the company and often resulted in new benefits for employees. However, such problems were not front and center at the Montgomery Shops until the Great Strike of July 1, 1922. The strike was instigated by a drastic 13% pay reduction instituted by the Railroad Labor Board on May 28, 1922. The board was established in 1920 after the close of World War I to oversee wages and working conditions for railroad workers. The railroad companies had requested the reduction, but the Labor Board took the brunt of the blame. Railroad Labor Board Chairman Ben W. Hooper, who had been appointed by President Warren Harding, compared mediating the dispute to pacifying a den of lions and tigers with bare hands, while he was only armed with gentle, unenforceable admonitions. At the peak of the strike, all members of the Federated Shopcrafts Union, which included all the skilled white labor, walked out. In the end, the strike forced several important concessions from the railroad companies, including a guaranteed 8-hour workday, overtime, holiday vacations, an order of seniority, and fixed pay rates. On a lighter side, the Courier included a gossip column and teasing anecdotes about one employee or another. Sometimes the stories were extraordinary. One of the notable residents at the shops was known as Roy Dickerson. He was an alligator that had wandered onto the property, perhaps after one of the Alabama River floods. Montgomery Shops employees housed him in a concrete pond, building an iron fence to keep him from causing trouble. In winter, when Roy Dickerson got too cold, employees would carry him like pallbearers into the planing mill and put him next to a radiator. As soon as he started waking up, they would rush him back out to the pond. The fence, however, was ultimately not enough to hold him, and he became known as an escape artist. On several occasions, the shops got a visit from the city police, telling them that Roy was scaring people downtown, and eventually, they told the shop's manager they had to get rid of him. The manager convinced the mayor to build him a pond in Oak Park, where the Montgomery Zoo was in its infancy. The enclosure was eventually home to several alligators and was popular with the local children. Roy Dickerson is said to have survived there into the 1960s. The western of Alabama shops weathered the interwar period in the 1920s and early 1930s surprisingly well despite the Great Depression and the increased cost of labor. However, the late 30s were more difficult with continued nationwide labor struggles and the diversification of transportation methods. Increasing competition from trucking companies and air freight coincided with lower agricultural shipping. World War II brought a brief, but dramatic, increase in freight and passenger traffic in support of the war effort, resulting in record profits. After the war, increased competition, lower demand, and more labor disputes led to a steady decline for the West Point route and its Montgomery shops. The Western Railway of Alabama entered the diesel era slowly, purchasing its first 4 diesel switchers from the Baldwin Company in 1944. Liking what it saw, the company purchased its first road diesel from the Electromotive Diesel Company in 1948. Its success in performance and cost reductions brought a flood of new orders, bringing the steam era to an end in July 1954. As new freight and passenger diesels came online, the company built the diesel shop, located between the blacksmith shop and the air compressor shop. In 1961, the shop substantially expanded the size and heavy maintenance capacity of the old machine shop and moved diesel maintenance into this updated facility. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, passenger traffic on the railroads faced dramatic challenges with the advent of automobiles and airline traffic. The need for increased efficiency and the shift toward freight traffic meant fewer jobs at the shops and ultimately a removal of all maintenance operations. In 1971, the shops closed and all operations shifted to Atlanta, ending an important era in Montgomery railroading. In the 1920s, there were well over 150 Class I railroads. By 1971, that number had been cut in half, and by the mid-1990s, there were only a handful of mega railroads. The Western Railway of Alabama, the Atlanta West Point Railroad, and the Georgia Railroad had merged with three other Montgomery rails. These were the Seaboard Airline, the Atlantic Coast Line, and the Louisville and Nashville Railroads. Together they became the Seaboard System Railroad in 1983, later being absorbed into CSX Transportation. Montgomery has been an important railroad center now for almost 200 years. The Western Railway of Alabama was there at the beginning, under its previous name, the Montgomery Railroad. It struggled to bring a brand new technology to Alabama in 1832, but engines have run through this city ever since the first engine started down the tracks in 1841.